Welcome to episode 134 of the Ask Historians podcast. Today we'll be talking with Professor Daniel Bessner on the topic of adjuncts and the structural problems of the academic labor market. Before we get into today's episode, we're going to have our monthly book raffle. This month's winner was Derek Parsons. Congratulations on winning this month's book raffle. We have, as usual, 3 options. You can choose, first is Quinn Slobodian's Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism. It's a very good book. I've read it, enjoyed it. It's been really well lauded and liked, even outside of academic circles. It's about basically the a kind of understudied aspect of neoliberal economic and political thought in the 20th century, and kind of the implications it has for different projects that neoliberalism was able to implement. So I think that that's a good choice. You also have a really recent book. I think I've already mentioned it and offered it in one episode, but I'm going to offer it again because it's just really good, because I finally was able to dig into it myself, and that's Daniel Immerwahr's How to Hide an Empire, or History of the Greater United States. I'm still only about a fifth of the way through the book, but it is an excellent history of basically how the United States has treated and legally codified parts of its territory which were not states. From early on, you had territories as the U.S. was moving west, but then you also had some territories that were outright called colonies in the early 20th century. Then you have Puerto Rico, which becomes the free associated state, and it's a really interesting history, and I think a really important one, especially since a lot of these histories don't get really talked about. Not that they're handled necessarily badly, but in a lot of texts you just don't. The U.S. acquires Puerto Rico, and then we just don't really talk about it, or something like that. So I think it's a really interesting and actually a really important book. And the last book is one I actually haven't had a chance to dig into, but which seemed really interesting, and which I actually have in my personal library already, which is Josep Fradera. I'm probably mispronouncing his name because it is Catalan, and I don't speak Catalan. But Josep Fradera's The Imperial Nation, Citizens and Subjects in the British, French, Spanish, and American Empires. It's a really interesting book on how citizenship and nationhood were constructed in these different imperial models. And you have, I think it's really valuable because, and it should be really valuable and interesting because not only has it been really well received, like I've seen people, very serious scholars, talk about how they're excellent books, but also it's an excellent book, but also the fact that it's a comparative study. So it's a comparison between the British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire. So I think that it's even more valuable potentially than a study of any one of these imperial models and their construction of nationhood in and of itself. I think that Fradera, being Catalan himself, will also make his analysis of the Spanish imperial model particularly interesting because he'll have special insights into it, and especially since, as many listeners no doubt know, Catalonia has a kind of special position within Spain itself, peninsular Spain, while France was basically able to absorb a lot of its regional identities. Catalan as a language and Catalonia as a region were never really absorbed in Spain, and just like Basque Country was never fully integrated in the same way as analogous regions were in France. So I think that this is going to be a really interesting book. So those are the 3 options. Once again, congratulations to Derek Parsons for his win this month. If you would like to be entered into the book raffle, all you have to do is donate to us on Patreon, and we will be more than happy to enter you into the into the running. We give one book away per month. All right, so with that said, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Andres Pertiera, and today we're here talking with Professor Daniel Bessner of the University of Washington. Professor Bessner is the Pyle Assistant Professor of American Foreign Policy. Professor Bessner, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on. So, what we're going to be talking about today is a bit more of a meta category. We're going to be having a discussion that often gets, on a topic that often gets academics very heated online, which is the great crisis of PhD overproduction and its relationship to the broader struggles of the academic job market. So,
and just very quickly, we should talk about whether it's a question of overproduction,
right,
and what that means. But yes, I that is totally how it's mostly framed in the academic discourse, and particularly the discourse of university administrators.
Right. So, in a nutshell, basically the argument is that given the reduction in the number of job placements in the academic job market, it really hasn't been doing well. Not just for the past decade, I'd say its decline's been probably 20 years, something like that. And that much of the onus for the suffering that a lot of academics are going through right now, especially those who haven't reached tenure, is that there's supposedly a crisis of overproduction of people with PhDs, and that the implicit solution to this is a reduction of the number of PhDs being produced. Would that be a correct summary?
Yes, and to me that solution, which I think you're correct in saying is often proposed, is incredibly problematic and really misses the forest for the trees in some sense. And we might want to talk about that a bit.
Right. No, exactly. So what to you is the problem with that premise?
So the basic problem with that premise is that there are many jobs. They're just being taught by the precariat, the emergent academic precariat. Basically, it's not even emergent at this point. It's basically just a permanent substructure of the academic political economy, which reflects a lot of the precariat, which reflects that precarious workers are working throughout the economy in various different jobs, and academia has unsurprisingly not escaped that. So it's not so much that there are too many PhDs being produced, but rather that the jobs at universities are almost all non-tenure track, whether they're visiting assistant professorships, which are sort of like term contracts for 2 to 3 years or 1 year in many cases. You teach 4 classes a year and you get a living wage, or much more common from what I understand, the rise of adjunct professorships, where you get a set amount per class, for example, usually something like $3,000-$4,000 per class, and people have to, from that, piece together a series of jobs, oftentimes at different campuses, and oftentimes come without benefits. So it's actually not that there are too many PhDs being produced, because there are certainly teaching jobs available, and we might also want to mention that there are other arrangements to imagine where you don't necessarily have to link research to teaching, as is done in Europe and other countries where there are research positionships and you don't have to teach. But in the American context, research and teaching are linked, and so but what has happened is that the tenure track professoriate has essentially been disemboweled, and that these positions that were previously tenure track have become staffed by adjuncts who understandably need to teach them if they want to survive in their chosen profession.
And I've seen some people push back on that counter-argument or counter-framing, saying that relatively speaking, the proportion of tenure and tenure track to adjunct positions hasn't gone that far out of whack. I haven't looked into the numbers quite yet. Is it like a statistical change, or?
Well, it's also I think that more and more people are entering universities and taking college classes. So to me, that almost misses the entire point. That again misses the forest for the trees. Is that there are clearly these jobs that could be filled and should be filled with people who have job benefits and tenure that currently aren't being filled. And I see no reason to apologize for academic historians or any academics to apologize for this situation on behalf of university administration. To me, that literally makes no sense, and I wouldn't countenance it in any serious way.
Right. But in terms of proportion, is the like I mean like just is the proportion argument actually technically true?
What do you mean by proportion?
Like I saw someone, I think it was actually
Adjunctships have risen. Yes, adjunctships have risen. Yes, that is proportionally risen. Yes, over the last, let's say, since World War II, which is the high water mark of the American university system. Let's say the 20 years after World War II, since the 1970s, yes, adjunctships have risen.
adjuncts have okay.
And yeah, and I'm sure someone can manipulate the numbers to prove whatever they want. But I think it's pretty clear that adjunctships have risen, as many charts and statistics have shown.
And so what would you say is the reason that you have this many people living in, I mean, is in precarity like this? Is the issue that just there's no funding for it? Is there funding and it's being used for other purposes? What would you?
Yeah, I mean, like anything, it's probably multi-causal, but I think a major reason that I would want to focus on is the rise of the shareholder revolution in the 1970s and 1980s, where companies began to be responsible, or people began to consider themselves responsible not to workers or even consumers, and there was a lot of problems with consumer capitalism. But let's elide that for a second. Instead of being responsible to consumers or to labor, they were responsible to shareholders, and I think the university reflected that larger social change. So you get the rise of boards of regents no longer being filled by former professors or community leaders in some sort of meaningful democratic way, but rather by business people, a bit oftentimes businessmen and people who try to apply a business logic to the university structure, which to my mind, one of its great benefits is its potential to exist outside of the normal neoliberal logic and the normal business logic. So I think that is a major cause where you get an entirely new political economic logic begins governing the university, beginning in the 1970s and 1980s, where universities are no longer perceived as some sort of institution that contributes to the social good, that educates society, but they rather begin to be perceived as money-making organizations. And so you see the total decline of the integrity of a number of institutions as reflected today. Maybe we should add with the scandal that recently came out today about rich people essentially literally bribing college officials in order to get their, I think in this case it was college athletics officials, in order to get their children into these universities. So colleges begin to change their reason for being and their social mission. I think beginning in the 70s and 80s, to focus much less on education and the public good, and to focus much more on being, as many big schools are described as, hedge funds with the university attached.
Right. So the issue in terms of so there is a change of like philosophy. I imagine that a lot of it has to do with where the funds are coming from, because my understanding is that during the Cold War, a lot of funds were relatively generously given from the federal government, and that's not so much the case anymore.
Yeah, and also it was given by the federal government for very particular Cold War reasons. So we have a situation where after World War II, the emergence of the really democratic university, which of course remained racist and patriarchal and closed to sexual minorities, which we all know, or at least probably most people listening to this podcast know, you basically have the emergence of security funding into universities, where the federal government starts giving lots of money to the sciences and even the social sciences and the humanities in order to fight the Cold War. I believe it's Eisenhower who passed an Education Act, which really increased funding to universities essentially for security purposes. This is where we get things like area studies. This is where we get FLAS, and a lot of these other programs, which have been ironically were greatly criticized in the 80s and 90s, and for very good reasons, because they are embedded in this type of security logic and the security architecture. But now that they're going away, they're not really being replaced with anything. So you have the decline of funding in the university, and you also have the progressive defunding of the university through state governments paying less and less for public universities and doing things like increasing tuition or attracting out-of-state students or attracting students from outside the United States in order to make up for the decreased federal funding that began to go away again beginning in the 70s and the 80s.
Right, and at the federal level, it kind of makes sense in the sense that what they no longer with the end of the Cold War, they didn't seem to really feel the need to invest all of that cash in all of these basically this research that could potentially be helpful if they're looking into they need an expert to talk about Southeast Asia or Africa or right. So that's the basic reason, right?
Well, it's not even talk about. I mean, they're essentially what they're trying to do, as far as I understand it, is to essentially create the expert elite that is going to be able to manage America's new global commitments in the Cold War, where the United States truly becomes a global hegemon and begins to consider, not just in the Western Hemisphere as occurred previously in American history, or areas of the Pacific as occurred with the Philippines, Hawaii, etc., but really began to view the world as its sovereign territory in a meaningful sense. So what the government was doing was essentially funding universities in order to create the managerial class that would be able to manage this emergent American empire. But essentially what has increasingly happened is that the United States government has outsourced a lot of these functions to private companies. Very famously, of course, diplomacy essentially no longer is really funded in the United States, especially when you compare the State Department's budget vis-a-vis the Department of Defense. But even a lot of our military fighting, as many people well know, is now conducted by private mercenaries. So you have a basic disinvestment in government functions, and the university loses out in that gamble. In that shift over the course of a series of decades.
This may be kind of an aside, but what do you mean, like I know about like Blackwater and things like that on the military side. What do you mean, foreign policy is outsourced?
In the sense that literally the techno-intellectual structures that develop American foreign policy are no longer contained within congressional research offices or even to a large degree with the State Department, but are rather outsourced to private, not nominally private think tanks or organizations that work primarily on government contract, even though they don't exist within the official structures of the American state. So as the university has been replaced by those types of think tanks and partisan research organizations, the Heritage Foundation, Brookings, CFR, RAND, some of them, of course, did have existed before the 1950s and 1960s, where federal government funding of universities really took off, but nonetheless changed their character to some degree to really supply knowledge to the American policymakers who wanted to govern the world.
Oh, I think I actually heard about that. I think it was on it was a Vox podcast where they talked about how the Senate oftentimes doesn't have the actual staff to do a research paper on how X law would be implemented. Right. So they outsource it to some think tank.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, right. So it's outsourced. So this is what's really interesting, and I hope to pursue this in my next book, which will be on the Rand Corporation. But you essentially have in the United States a peculiar form of statehood where the state is really, truly, a lot of state functions are privatized. So to what degree is a think tank really a private organization when it's essentially, serving to develop public policy, I think is a really interesting question, and which also, raises difficult questions about how one wants to change American policy. Where does one actually, what are the weak points in the system through which one could actually look to change policy? But this is all to say, with the university, as the privatization of the American government began to occur more and more over the course of the late 20th century, universities began to receive less and less funding. And I think that, coupled with the rise of the administrative class of the university, which occurred due to a variety of reasons. I think most prominently the corporatization of the university, that is to say, modeling universities no longer on imagined medieval predecessors like Oxford and Cambridge, but rather on corporations like GE or AT&T, brought in a new logic that emphasized the importance of cost saving at the expense of scholarship, which I think over time led to the decrease in tenure track positions, which helped lead to the absolutely dismal job market in which we find ourselves today.
Right. And so there's less funding. There's also a different kind of logic in how the funding is spent. I imagine also on the university side, it's often alleged that a lot more funding is being spent on things like administration or maybe a really pretty building. Though I've also heard that part of the issue with that sometimes the criticism of the administration is a bit overblown, because with the ballooning number of people at universities, you do need a bit more administrative staff. Where would you say the criticism should lie? I'm trying to be fair.
Sure, you do certainly need more administrative staff, but in my opinion, more administrative staff should never, under any circumstances, come at the expense of tenure track faculty, and that is precisely what happened. Moreover, I am of the opinion that we have overcorrected. I don't know, maybe corrected might not be the right word, but we've turned in the wrong direction, where administrators make so much more than professors oftentimes, and there are so many more administrators, or at least when compared to, I think, the professors that are needed to teach classes, that it's become a serious problem. And this is not to demonize administrators in the sense that we're all part of this system, and oftentimes this system appears natural. But I think that it is very clear that the rise of the administrative university has come at the expense of tenure track faculty, particularly in the humanities and the social sciences.
And in terms of local state governments, we talked a bit about the federal government, but in terms of state governments, in addition to, some people just having just feeling like the universities should be minimally subsidized, just as a matter of political philosophy. Let's also look at it at another angle. Do you think that thinking especially of poorer states, do you think that it is reasonable to expect local governments to be able to fund it? And is it an issue of like they're kind of being like they may not be fulfilling their obligations, but also the federal government's kind of leaving them with a shorthanded?
So what's exactly the question? I think as a matter of philosophy, should state governments fund universities? Yes.
Well, no. I mean, as a matter of philosophy, yes. So what I'm saying is, you obviously have very famous cases, Scott Walker, who have more philosophical reasons or political philosophy, ideological reasons for defunding universities. But I also imagine that state governments, when federal funding for universities starts drying up, state governments, especially as they have other expenses and different issues with their tax base, they may not be able to fully meet the needs that are created by the federal government taking a step back.
Yeah, I mean, I think that essentially that's a political question, and I think universities need to do things like go out into local communities and make the case for themselves. I do think that is state governments do have to respond to particular fiscal pressures, of course, because this is the world in which we live. But to me, it's really a fundamental problem of political values. And that what we need to do is participate in a project whereby all Americans understand the importance of universities to not only come up with practical scientific solutions, but also as a means to educate oneself in the world. And I think the problem with this is that the political economy has become so immiserated, is that universities have begun to rebrand themselves as focused solely on basically providing students with the skills that will necessarily lead them to getting a job. And so what happens is that in the humanities and social sciences, we essentially try to defend ourselves by claiming that we're going to give you the skills too. You don't have to major in business, or you don't have to major in communications, pre-professional majors. You could also major in history and anthropology and literature, and you'll get the necessary skills to get a job. To me, that's ultimately a losing battle because I don't think that's what the humanities or the social sciences are necessarily for. It's not for skills building practices, but it's in order to teach you a particular way to view the world, to expand your mind, to have you understand your own place in a large historical stream, that's what, if I were to advise my colleagues, I would say we should defend ourselves on our own ground instead of ceding this sort of skills-based ground. And instead, what we should do is educate our students to appreciate the degree to which that sort of skills-based logic deprives them of living the fullest possible life, a life in which they not only are focused on getting a job to work at McKinsey or Bain or whatever it may be, but are also focused on sort of appreciating literature, art, history, other cultures, languages, etc., because that enables them to live a fuller life.
Right. And it's also an argument which is not entirely convincing just from the point of view of uh, a PhD is a huge time commitment. A master's is a huge time and money commitment. All of these things are huge commitments, and if you're not specifically looking to go into to actually use those skills, if you're just looking for like learning courses that help you think, there's kind of a better way to go about it. If you're just looking at it job market wise.
Yeah, I was just referring to sort of the undergraduate justification, but it's certainly in terms of humanities PhDs and social science PhDs, I think Alt-Ac is well intentioned, although I don't think it will do much. I mean, there's no reason to get a 7-year PhD in medieval history in order to become a consultant or to become a high school teacher or to become a museum curator. And that is in no way to insult or deride or degrade any of those jobs by any stretch of the imagination, but they're just different jobs and what it means to be a PhD researcher. It's just not why one gets a PhD. And if that's the best solution that we have, I think we're in deep trouble. I think we need to think about building solidarities across history, across subfields of history, but also across the humanities and social sciences. I think without faculty solidarity, this problem is just going to get worse, and the faculty will wind up seeing themselves basically pushed out of existence.
Before we start looking into possible solutions, what would you say? Let's look at it in a couple different angles. What would you say is, for example, the impact that this has had on the production of PhDs, and then also from among those who have already graduated, on the lives and research and work of their respective fields of already graduated PhD students?
So it seems like for a long time it didn't have much of an effect on the production of PhDs, but I know from my own anecdotal experience that it does seem that finally PhD programs are significantly contracting. And I say finally with a bit of a bitter taste in my mouth because I think it's a shame that essentially the history departments are pulling up the ladder behind them and preventing future generations of historians from being trained. But I understand why they're doing it. They don't have the funding and they don't want to basically recruit tons of people who aren't going to get jobs. So I appreciate it. But it is a real social loss. Think about all the knowledge that we will no longer have because people are no longer being admitted into history programs. And so I think that relates to the second part of your question, is that I think a lot of people that I know are rightly embittered that they produced great work, did quote unquote everything that they were supposed to do. They published, they won prestigious grants, they moved around for VAP ships, they moved around for postdocs, and they're still unable to get, and I should also add, they went to the quote unquote right schools, which is another problem we could talk about, sort of the prestige economy of history, where only people who essentially go to the top schools, and from my understanding, a small number of the top schools, I don't remember which ones, get jobs, but they did everything that was right. The colleagues and people that I know, and they're still unable to get tenure track jobs. And I think they're rightfully embittered, and they're very angry at first the profession, the discipline, for not really doing much to aid them except giving, minor talks about Alt-Ac, which really doesn't help, and the university system itself, which profited off their labor for many, many years and essentially has done nothing to aid them in their time of most dire need. So I think you have a generation of humanities and social science scholars who are rightfully very angry at the situation in which they find themselves. And I think we need to do, those of us like myself who are on the tenure track, we really need to do significant solidarity building efforts, both with the people who are not on the tenure track and who are adjuncts or VAPs or postdocs, but also with our colleagues from previous generations of scholars who might not appreciate the degree to which the system has totally collapsed, or beyond the degree, sort of the emotional the harrowing emotional experience of being on the job market for years and constantly moving around, putting your life on hold, letting your personal life suffer because you're moving around from VAP to VAP-ship or from postdoc to postdoc. And I think we need to build a real consciousness and solidarity amongst our fellow historians if we're going to have any chance of changing this situation.
Right. And I would imagine that also it's really hard to produce top-notch scholarship if you're continuously moving and living in a constant economic precarity and maybe depressed because you have this sort of Damocles of failure like constantly hanging over your head. So I imagine this is also.
Yeah, even though it's not a fail, I mean, I think we should underline, like, at least no one from my generation that I know views that as a failure. I certainly don't. I honestly.
A failure of the system.
The failure of the system, yes. It's in no way a personal failure, and I think in our society it's often individualized when it's a total structural issue. So I know you're not saying that at all, but I just want to underline, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a good clarification. Yeah, it's not saying it's individual, but it's. I mean, like I would imagine that this has also impacted the production of scholarship because. How are you supposed to write a book, 2 books, continue your research, whatever, if you can't sleep at night just because you've got this like constant rolling disaster.
Right. You can't. You can't. You really just can't. And I think, again, I just want to underline all of the knowledge that will not be produced because of the job market. I think we're losing literally generations of knowledge, generations of books that would have been written if not for the terrible job market. I mean, I know personally when I was on the market, I think I was on the market for 3 years in total. It's an incredibly depressing experience. It's incredibly anxiety producing. I remember I wasn't sleeping well. I was constantly nervous. I was constantly checking my phone to see if someone emailed me about a potential job interview. It's really anxiety producing, and it's a really cruel and frankly inhumane system that, again, we as a profession, we as a discipline need to do more. The AHA has not taken, in my opinion, the most minor steps. For example, just banning AHA interviews. No one who doesn't have a tenure track job should be forced to pay any amount of money to travel during a high holiday travel season to a very cold, oftentimes, city to interview for one job. So we haven't even taken the most basic step to make this a little bit of a less inhumane process. So I'm a bit nervous, frankly, about the future of the field and its ability to mobilize in a meaningful way to help those in the profession who are in a less fortunate position than those of us who have tenure track jobs.
Right. And I mean, it's kind of anecdotal, but I'm hearing that there's also like major funding issues in Europe as well, which I mean, I imagine there's there are broader neoliberal processes that they probably have in common with the U.S., but I imagine it's also slightly different in Europe.
I don't know enough about Europe's situation, but from what I can tell from my friends in the UK, it's a bit of a different situation because there is no tenure in the UK in the same way. There's job security, but it's not quite tenure in the American context. But from what I could tell from my friends who teach in the UK, it's not a particularly great job market there either, and that there are a lot of significant problems in the UK in terms of finding a stable job as well. I think it's an analogous situation. It's not precisely the same.
So what would you say are, you've mentioned solidarity, but what would you say are kind of the bigger picture solutions that need to happen in order to address this?
One thing that I think would be important to do is for the AHA, if it's at all possible, is to begin thinking of itself more as a lobbying organization similar to the AMA or the ABA, the American Medical Association, the American Bar Association, and begin advocating on behalf of its members' rights. And also, considering things like organizing, there needs to be perhaps a nationwide union of historians. Certainly, there needs to be unions at universities, and we need to think about what we could do, how we could use our labor, whether it makes sense to go on strike, to advocate in favor of getting rid of adjunctships and things along those lines. I think we need to look to the past history of labor struggle in order to start building the types of coalitions that we need in order to advocate in favor of our interests. And I would add, not only for our fellow historians to get jobs, even though that is, I think, in my opinion, the number one priority, but also for the social good. I think a society is very much impoverished when its universities themselves become impoverished, and new knowledge isn't being produced, and we don't know enough about our own past, as has been demonstrated perhaps a bit too much with the historians doing the work of correcting Dinesh D'Souza on Twitter. I think that is meaningful work to do, and if we don't have future historians, who's going to do it? So there's a material argument in favor of people who need to have jobs because they need to live in this sort of capital society. But there's also the argument, which I find also meaningful, about the need to have history for the general social good.
Right. And so AHA could become more lobby-like in terms of organizing for its membership. I guess lobby-like, but also union-like, it seems like.
Yes, like a sort of a craft union or a trade union, something along those lines. And I think the AHA in particular, having the infrastructure, it needs to be more aggressive in its actions. And I'm not certain about this, but I would imagine that the majority of AHA officers, if not all of them, come from at least research universities and probably top liberal arts colleges. So it might make sense also to diversify the leadership cadre of the AHA to include adjuncts, to include visiting assistant professors, because I think it's important to have those perspectives who are basically the majority of our field. Incorporated into the decision-making structure of the discipline. So I think we also need to think about that. Again, those of us with the job security who are able to do things like this need to be far more active in inviting VAPs, postdocs, and adjuncts into the corridors of historical power. And that takes place at the national level, and also at our own individual university level. We need to do the same thing, not allow adjuncts to be invisible, but to appreciate how many courses that they teach and how the entire university structure depends on them, and therefore all adjuncts, like frankly all people, I might add, deserve job security, deserve benefits, deserve to be paid not only a living wage but a good wage. And I think these are the sorts of things that we need to be very much in favor and forcefully advocating for.
And what do you think is in addition to the AHA, do you think the AHA would play a complementary role? By the way, just in case we haven't spelled this out, AHA is American Historical Association. I'm pretty sure you already said that, but
just in case, yeah, no, it's always good
just
to make
in case.
Sure.
But yeah, so in addition, do you see like there's a lot of grad students who have been, in addition to obviously adjuncts, a lot of grad students who've been unionizing of late. Do you see that as a complementary process, or do you think like the AHA should bring them in and make that part of the AHA's process?
It's difficult to know because we're in such early days. So I mean that could be good for them to be in the AHA, or could be bad. It'll have to play out. But I definitely see the unionization of graduate workers as being incredibly important, and an incredibly important first step. The same is true when you see unionization of non-tenure track workers. I think this is really important and a really excellent and positive step in the right direction.
But I mean, like, part of the problem is that given the structures of how universities work, and basically they are the employers and they have basically almost everything in their favor.
Well, we have our labor power. I mean, this is the thing. Like we actually have everything. Without us, the university doesn't function. So we need to figure out a way to again organize. A random strike or stoppage of labor is purposeless. That's not what I'm advocating. But I am advocating building solidarity through through building class consciousness, frankly, in the old Marxian sense, and also building an organization that would be able to actually challenge the increasing degradation of the university on behalf of those who are less fortunate.
And you're saying not just within the profession, but also having people from the public come in, basically.
Well, yeah, I think this also needs to be incorporated with a public education effort where we as professors go out and not just do things like provide historical facts, but really make ethical arguments in favor of the university, and particularly in favor of forms of knowledge that aren't focused on short-term skills building. Because again, I don't think that the ultimate purpose of the humanities is not to make someone a good worker so they could work for Apple. To me, that is not the purpose of the humanities or the social sciences, is to allow someone to live a full life in the short time that we have here on Earth. And I think we need to move beyond the neoliberal logic that has been often used, or the neoliberal language and discourses that have been used to defend the humanities, which I don't think, because I don't think we're going to win on that ground. I don't think that's where our strength is. And so I think we need to, again, develop a new discursive context to defend ourselves from our very many detractors in this country at this moment.
Got it. So that and but that would be a. I mean, would the AHA also need to exercise some influence on like the national level? Because it sounds like since much of the funding that was cut back on is federal, you would need a lot of federal lobbying at the federal level.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be difficult for historians to do that themselves. Ideally, you'd see a similar process occurring across disciplines to create one sort of massive humanities social science organization, right? And so it's not like historians are the only ones suffering from a terrible job market. I think all of the humanities and social sciences are, except maybe economics. So I think that given that that's the case, I think that there might be actually an opportunity to build these sorts of cross-disciplinary solidarities. It might be difficult to do with law professors and medical professors and natural scientists because their funding structures are totally different. But that I think is a question that we'll have to confront going forward. But I think certainly amongst the humanities and social sciences, there's enough shared material interest to begin building a base of solidarity from which we could begin to challenge the adjunctification of the university and essentially what might be called a deprofessionalization of academic humanities and social science research.
One of the things that I've heard in terms of uh, like pushback in terms of why you don't see more tenured professors jumping in is that I've seen people say that some of older professors may not necessarily see themselves as workers, people who have a profession.
Right, right. And that's nonsense. I mean, that's this nonsense fetishization of academia as a calling, which is absurd in a capitalist economy. Maybe if we lived in communist utopia, we could begin to talk like that. But listen, we're all workers. We don't live in feudal Europe. I have no time for that argument. That's absurd. I totally reject that and reject it categorically.
Right. No, I mean like in terms of like whether or not they're correct in feeling that way. But do you think that some older professors do feel that way?
I'm sure they do. I mean, when people grow up in different contexts, they have different opinions about things. So I'm certain there are certain older professors. Although to be frank, I would be surprised if that was the majority position amongst professors, regardless of age. I think most people appreciate that we're workers in a capitalist economy and basically sell our labor for wages or for salaries, as the case may be. I imagine that's actually not a particularly wide held belief, except amongst sort of posturing conservatives. And also, I don't even think conservatives really believe it. I think they're just trying to own the libs when they say things like that because it's so patently ridiculous.
So in terms of so it seems like there's kind of the only other the proponents of reducing PhD candidates as a solution to this crisis their argument seems to mostly boil down to a kind of pessimistic view that the battle has already been fought and lost, and we just have to kind of adapt. How would you?
No, I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, it's not adapting. Then we just lost and we're dying. So I think if we actually care about saving this profession and saving academic research, we can't adopt a defeatist attitude. I mean, it's the old Gramsci quote, right? Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Because I do think human beings make their own reality. And I do think that the election of Trump has demonstrated that people aren't satisfied with the status quo. And at least among my students, I mean, they want their professors to be well funded because that makes their own education better. And they appreciate the importance of academic research. And And I don't think that the solution to this problem is just to pull up the ladder behind us. I don't think that that's fair to the next generation of historians. I think that the solution, again, is for those in positions of privilege like myself to actually do the organizing work that would allow those in less fortunate positions to do the career that they were trained to do, and many of them will no doubt do it to a very good degree. So I think that is the solution, not just to give up and say that's it, we're fucked, but to actually try to organize and change the situation in which we found ourselves.
And assuming, what do you think would be the long-term impact of like the current the current trends continuing as they are? What do you think the long-term impact would be on the profession?
The total deprofessionalization of the humanities and social sciences, I think, would probably see tenure start being eliminated. It's also starting to be eliminated. I think you'll see the destruction of the languages, which is also something that is happening in many spaces. And basically, I just think you'll see the continued degradation of humanities and social science research, which I think will have negative social benefits in the medium and short terms, but also just negative humanistic benefits. Negative humanistic consequences, in the sense that there's a humanist interest in knowing our history and that increasing knowledge. So, and I think that would be a great shame for this country and basically for humanity as a whole.
Right, and also the U.S.'s foreign policy impacts a huge part of the world, and so if our experts are making decisions and don't understand basic U.S. history and foreign policy and context, it kind of has an impact on people's concrete lives.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and then what happens is that myth just takes over for history. And so you have these sort of like mythic, vague ideas that actually guide people in how they work, which is not a source of any sort of good policy or good thing in the world.
And so we've got AHA taking a more proactive role, building of more like solidarity with the public. You've got a more close working between people who are in more privileged positions like tenured faculty and grad students and adjuncts all working together. Would that be a good summary of like your pitch for how we should approach this?
Yes, that would be my pitch, and also for those who don't want to do that work frankly, if I was abused by a system for very many years, I wouldn't necessarily want to dedicate myself to transforming it. I think also thinking about how one could use their research skills in the service of positive goals, which is what that Chronicle article I wrote was about, which is sort of using the deep research skills that one has in favor of what I consider to be a necessity, sort of the social democratic transformation of American politics away from neoliberal capitalism and towards a more social democratic path, which is, I think, something that people could do instead of, leading their lives in this degrading way, sort of traveling around constantly with very little benefit and for very little money. And of course, not everyone will be able to do that, which is why it's important that we also do the complementary project, and the most important project, in my opinion, which is ensuring that adjunctification is not only halted, but also reversed.
Perfect. So I think our listeners have a pretty solid introduction to the problem. We're probably not going to elucidate this completely, but at least we have a good starting point for people to start thinking about this, because it is an urgent issue that affects not just those of us within the profession, but also the greater public, because if you don't have historians researching history, that kind of impacts everybody.
Yes, I think that's correct.
Yeah. So, do you have any other parting messages, or?
No. Thank you so much for having me on. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll keep on in this good fight.
Yeah, let's do it.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com, and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.